My name is Anna Roger. I'm 36 years old. And the day my mother-in-law stood in my parents' driveway and asked me, with a straight face, to hand her a set of keys to a house she had never once been invited into, I realized that politeness had run its course in my family, and something else was going to have to take its place. She didn't ask like a guest. She asked like someone collecting on a debt. Just in case, she said. Family should have access to family property. My parents were standing right there. My father's jaw went tight. My mother's hand found my elbow and squeezed it once, hard, the way she used to when I was a teenager about to say something I couldn't take back. I didn't say anything back to her that afternoon. I smiled, told her I'd think about it, and drove home in silence next to my husband, who spent the entire 20-minute ride explaining why his mother wasn't wrong to ask. To understand how we got to that driveway, and how I answered her 3 weeks later in a way that left her without a single word to say, I have to take you back to the beginning. Welcome back to Calm Stories Time. This is the channel where we talk about family, boundaries, and the quiet decisions that end up defining everything. If any part of today's story feels familiar to you, drop a comment and let us know, and if you haven't yet, go ahead and subscribe, because we've got a lot more stories like this one coming. I work as a project manager for a regional logistics company outside Charlotte, North Carolina. It's not glamorous work, but it suits me. I like systems. I like knowing where every piece is supposed to go and who's accountable when something slips. It's a skill that turned out to matter more in my personal life than I ever expected it to. My husband is Marcus Whitfield. He's 38, works in commercial insurance, and for the first 4 years of our marriage, I would have told you without hesitation that I married a good man. He's steady. He doesn't raise his voice. He remembers to take the trash out without being asked. On paper, and in practice for a long time, he was easy to love. We met at a mutual friend's wedding when I was 28. He made me laugh within the first 10 minutes, which is rarer than people think. We dated for 2 years, got engaged on a hiking trip in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and married the following spring in my parents' backyard, under a tent my father built himself out of PVC pipe and canvas because he refused to pay a rental company for something he could put together on a Saturday. That's my father in a sentence. Practical to the point of stubbornness, and generous in ways that never announce themselves. My parents are Robert and Linda Whitfield, well, Robert and Linda Ashford, since I took Marcus's name and they kept theirs. My father spent 31 years as a union electrician, the last 12 of them running crews for a contracting firm that built hospitals and schools across the state. My mother taught 4th grade for 26 years at the same elementary school, the kind of teacher who still gets Christmas cards from students who graduated college a decade ago. They are not wealthy people in the way people mean when they say wealthy. They are careful people. Every raise my father got over 3 decades went somewhere specific, a retirement account, a home repair fund, a house they bought in 2009 during the market crash, when everyone else was terrified to buy anything. It's a modest 4-bedroom brick colonial on 2 acres outside Asheville, the house I grew up finishing my adolescence in, the house where my wedding reception happened, the house where my parents planned to spend the rest of their lives and eventually, God willing, a long way off, leave to me and my younger brother. That house is not mine. I want to be clear about that from the start, because it matters enormously to everything that happens next. It was never gifted to me. It was never put in my name. It belongs, fully and completely, to my parents, the 2 people who built it dollar by careful dollar over 15 years of ordinary, unglamorous work. Which is exactly why, when my mother-in-law demanded a set of keys to it, the request wasn't just inappropriate. It was almost absurd. And the fact that she asked anyway tells you everything you need to know about who she is, and what she believed she was entitled to. Her name is Patricia Whitfield. And her story, the one that explains why she thought those keys belonged to her, starts long before I ever met her. Section 2, Patricia's background and early warning signs. Patricia Whitfield is 66 years old. She spent most of her career working the front desk at a orthodontics practice in Gastonia, the kind of job where you learn everyone's business through insurance paperwork and appointment scheduling. She raised Marcus and his older sister, Diane, mostly on her own after their father left when Marcus was 14. That part of her story is real, and it's not nothing. Her husband, Roger, walked out with almost no warning, moved 2 states away with a woman he'd been seeing for over a year, and left Patricia to figure out a mortgage on a single income. She kept the house for 6 years before the bank finally caught up with her and she had to sell it and move into a rental. Marcus has told me that story more times than I can count, always with the same ending, and that's why family means everything to her. She lost everything once. She's not going to let it happen again. I understood that story. I had sympathy for it. What I didn't understand, not at first, was how Patricia had translated that loss into a belief that other people's stability existed to be shared with her, whether they offered it or not. The early years of our marriage, Patricia was present but not invasive. She came to holidays. She called on Sundays. She had opinions about the wedding, about our first apartment, about when we should have children, and she voiced every one of them, but voicing an opinion is not the same as acting on one, and for a long time, that's all it was. The shift happened gradually, the way these things usually do. It started with small comments about my parents' house. The first time Patricia visited my parents' place, for our 4th of July cookout 18 months into our marriage, she walked through the downstairs rooms slowly, almost like she was appraising it. "This is a lovely home," she said to my mother. "You must have worked so hard for this." My mother, gracious as always, thanked her. Patricia kept talking. "It's so big for just the 2 of you now that the kids are grown. Robert must have done well for himself." My mother smiled and changed the subject, but she mentioned the comment to me later that night, in the kitchen, drying dishes. "Your mother-in-law asked me twice how many square feet this place is," she said. Once at the cookout, and once again on her way out the door. I laughed it off at the time. I told my mother that Patricia was just making conversation, that some people process admiration through questions instead of compliments. I believed that, mostly, because I wanted to. The comments continued over the next year, always small, always framed as observation rather than request. It must be nice to have parents with a place like that to fall back on. I bet holidays are easier when there's that much room to spread out. You're lucky, Marcus, marrying into a family with property like this. Marcus never pushed back on any of it. If anything, he seemed to enjoy it, the way people enjoy being complimented by association. I started to notice that when we visited my parents, Marcus would casually mention things to his mother afterward, how many bedrooms, what the property taxes probably ran, whether my parents had ever talked about downsizing. I didn't think much of it. I assumed it was small talk, the kind of detail sharing that happens naturally between a son and his mother. I was wrong about that, and I wouldn't understand how wrong until almost 2 years later. The real shift happened after Roger, Patricia's ex-husband, died unexpectedly of a heart attack. Marcus flew out for the funeral. Patricia didn't go, the 2 of them hadn't spoken in over a decade, but the death seemed to unlock something in her. She started talking, more openly than before, about being alone. About getting older without a safety net. About watching her friends' children buy houses and build lives while she was still renting a 2-bedroom apartment on a fixed income from a job she'd left 5 years earlier. "I just don't want to be a burden," she told me once, over dinner at our house, in a tone that somehow managed to sound like the opposite of what the words meant. But it would be nice to know that if something happened, there was somewhere for me to go. Somewhere safe. Family should be able to count on family. I told her, gently, that she would always be welcome to stay with us if she ever needed to. She smiled at that, but it wasn't the smile of someone who'd gotten the answer she wanted. It was the smile of someone recalculating. 3 weeks later, she brought up my parents' house directly for the first time. Not as an observation. As a plan. It was a Sunday dinner at Patricia's apartment, the kind of monthly obligation Marcus and I kept out of habit more than enthusiasm. Diane, Marcus's sister, was there too, along with her boyfriend at the time, a quiet man named Todd who mostly nodded along to whatever Patricia said. We were partway through dessert when Patricia set her fork down and looked at me with an expression I'd come to recognize as her serious face, the one she used when she wanted something to land as more than casual conversation. "Anna, I've been thinking," she said. "Your parents' place out in Asheville. They have that whole finished basement that just sits empty most of the year, don't they?" I told her it wasn't empty, exactly. My father used it as a workshop, and my mother kept her sewing room down there. "Well, sure, but there's still that extra bedroom and bathroom down there that nobody uses," Patricia said. I was thinking, it might make sense for me to have a key. Not to move in, nothing like that, just to have access. In case of emergencies. Or if I ever wanted to stay for a weekend without having to coordinate schedules with everyone. I remember the room going quiet in a specific way, the way a room goes quiet when everyone at the table has heard something they weren't prepared for and is waiting to see who reacts first. I said, as evenly as I could, that the house belonged to my parents, and any question about keys or access would need to come from them, not from me. Patricia's expression shifted, just slightly. "Well, of course, I just meant, since we're family now. It's not like I'd be a stranger showing up. I thought maybe you could mention it to them. It would mean so much to me to know I had somewhere like that, especially now, with Roger gone and everything so uncertain." Marcus, to his credit in that moment, didn't say anything to push the idea forward. But he didn't say anything to shut it down either. He just kept eating his dessert, the way he always did when a conversation got uncomfortable, letting the silence do the work of ending the subject rather than actually ending it himself. I changed the topic. We finished dinner. We drove home. And in the car, I asked Marcus directly, did his mother expect me to actually go to my parents and ask them to give her a key to their house? He sighed, the particular sigh he reserved for moments when he wanted me to stop making something into a bigger deal than he thought it was. "She's just lonely, Anna. She's not trying to move in. She just wants to feel like she has options. You could at least mention it to your parents. It doesn't have to mean anything." I told him no. I told him it wasn't my place to ask my parents to give a set of house keys to a woman they'd met a handful of times, and that if Patricia wanted something like that, she needed to understand it wasn't a small ask, even if she framed it as one. Marcus didn't argue further that night, but I could tell from the set of his jaw that he thought I was overreacting, that I was being rigid about something that, to him, was just his mother trying to feel secure in a hard chapter of her life. I let it go. I told myself it was a one-time comment, born out of grief and financial anxiety, and that it wouldn't come up again. It came up again 4 months later, and this time it wasn't a comment over dessert. It was a plan already in motion. My parents hosted a Labor Day cookout, the kind they did every year, with half the extended family and a handful of neighbors wandering through the backyard with paper plates. Patricia and Diane came along with Marcus and me. It was, on the surface, a pleasant afternoon. Toward the end of the evening, as people were starting to leave, I noticed Patricia and my father standing together near the garage, deep in conversation. I couldn't hear what was being said, but I could see my father's posture, arms crossed, weight shifted back slightly, the stance he takes when he's being polite to someone he doesn't fully trust. When I asked him about it later that night on the phone, he told me exactly what Patricia had said. She'd asked him, casually, whether he and my mother had ever thought about putting a lockbox on the side door for emergencies. When my father asked what kind of emergency she meant, she said something about wanting to make sure everyone in the family had a way to check on the house if my parents were ever traveling, or sick, or unreachable. She mentioned, specifically, that it would put her mind at ease to know she had a way in if she ever needed it. My father, a man who has never once minced words in his life, told her the house wasn't set up for that kind of access and that if anyone needed to check on things, they'd call him or my mother directly. He said Patricia nodded, smiled, and said, "Of course, I understand, I just worry about things," and dropped the subject. But she hadn't dropped it. She'd just changed her approach. And 2 weeks after that conversation, I found out exactly how far she was willing to go to get what she wanted. 2 weeks after the Labor Day cookout, my mother called me on a Tuesday afternoon, her voice tighter than I'd heard it in years. "Anna, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me," she said. "Did you or Marcus give Patricia our address and tell her she could stop by whenever she wanted?" I told her no, absolutely not, and asked what had happened. My mother explained that she'd come home from the grocery store that morning to find Patricia's car in the driveway. Patricia was standing on the front porch with a folder of what my mother described as paperwork, waiting for someone to answer the door, even though she hadn't called ahead or been invited. When my mother asked what she needed, Patricia said she'd been in the area, a claim that made no sense, since Patricia lived nearly 40 minutes away in Gastonia and had no reason to be anywhere near Asheville on a Tuesday morning. She said she wanted to talk about formalizing some family arrangements and pulled out a printed sheet from a locksmith company, a quote for rekeying the side door and installing a keypad entry system, the kind that lets you assign individual codes to different people. My mother, stunned, asked her what exactly she was proposing. Patricia told her, without any apparent awareness of how it sounded, that she thought it would be smart for the family to have a shared entry system, so that everyone, meaning herself, specifically, could come and go as needed without disturbing my parents' schedule. She said she'd already spoken to a locksmith and gotten a quote, and she just needed my parents' approval to move forward. My mother told her, as politely as she could manage, that they had no interest in installing a new entry system and that she wasn't sure why Patricia thought this was something the family needed. Patricia's response, according to my mother, was to say, "Well, I just think it's important that everyone feels like they belong here. Anna and Marcus are married now. That makes us family. And family should have keys to each other's homes." My mother told her, firmly, that the house belonged to her and my father, and that decisions about who had access to it were theirs to make, not a group decision among extended family. Patricia left shortly after that, folder in hand, visibly unhappy but not saying much else. My mother called me within the hour, still shaken. I called Marcus at work and told him what had happened. There was a long pause on the line before he responded, and when he did, it wasn't the response I needed. "She's probably just trying to be thoughtful," he said. "I know it sounds weird, but that's kind of how she shows she cares. She wants to feel included." I told him that showing up unannounced at my parents' house with a locksmith quote for a keypad entry system was not thoughtfulness. It was a plan, executed without permission, aimed at securing physical access to a property that had nothing to do with her. Marcus got quiet. Then he said something that told me exactly how deep this had gone without my noticing. "She mentioned something like this to me a few weeks ago. I told her it probably wasn't a big deal either way, since we visit so often. I didn't think she'd actually go talk to your parents about it." I sat with that for a long moment. My husband had known his mother was planning to approach my parents about keyed access to their house, and rather than telling me, rather than shutting the idea down, he'd told her it probably wasn't a big deal. I asked him directly, did he think it was appropriate for his mother to have a key, or a code, to my parents' house? He hesitated. That hesitation told me more than any answer could have. Eventually he said, "I don't see the harm in it, honestly. It's not like she'd be using it to do anything. She just wants to feel like she has a place." "You're being pretty rigid about this, Anna." That word, rigid, would come up again and again over the following weeks, every time I drew a line Marcus thought was unnecessary. It became his shorthand for any boundary that inconvenienced his mother. I told him, calmly, that this wasn't about rigidity. It was about the fact that his mother had gone behind my parents' backs, priced out a physical modification to their home, and presented it to them as something that had already been decided rather than something she was asking permission for. I told him that regardless of what his mother wanted to feel, my parents' house was not communal property, and no one, not Patricia, not Marcus, not even me, had any claim to a key. Marcus didn't respond to that directly. He just said he'd talk to his mother. I don't know what that conversation looked like, but I know what happened 2 weeks later, because Patricia called my parents' house directly, and this time, she wasn't asking for a keypad. She was asking, plainly, for a spare key to be cut and given to her. The call came on a Saturday morning in October. My mother picked up, expecting it to be a robocall or a school fundraiser, and instead heard Patricia's voice, warm and rehearsed in a way my mother said made her stomach drop before Patricia had even finished her first sentence. Patricia asked if she could stop by that afternoon. My mother, not wanting to seem unwelcoming, said that would be fine, assuming this was a normal visit. It was not. Patricia arrived just after 2 o'clock. Marcus and I happened to be there that day too, helping my father clear out gutters before the fall rains set in, which meant I witnessed what happened next firsthand instead of hearing about it secondhand. Patricia got out of her car holding a small gift bag, the kind you'd bring to a birthday party, and walked up the driveway with the same rehearsed warmth she'd used on the phone. She handed my mother the bag, which turned out to contain a decorative key holder, the kind you hang by a front door with hooks for house keys, already labeled with masking tape in 4 sections: Robert, Linda, Anna and Marcus, and Patricia. My mother stood there holding it, momentarily speechless, while Patricia explained, brightly, that she thought it would be a lovely way to formalize what she called the family's open-door policy, and that all she needed now was for my parents to have a spare key cut for her so she could add it to the holder herself. My father, who had come around from the side of the house at the sound of voices, set down the gutter scoop he was holding and walked over. He looked at the key holder, looked at Patricia, and asked her directly what made her think she was entitled to a key to his house. Patricia's smile faltered, but only for a second. "Robert, we're family," she said. "Anna and Marcus are married. That makes all of us connected. I just think it's important that everyone feels like they have a place here, especially since I don't have much family of my own left." My father's voice, when he responded, was calm but absolutely final. "Patricia, I understand you've had a hard few years. I'm sorry about that, genuinely. But this house belongs to me and my wife. It's not shared property between extended family. You visiting is one thing, and you're welcome to do that, with notice, like anyone else. But you are not getting a key to my house." Patricia's face changed then, the warmth draining out of it and something harder taking its place. "Just in case," she said. "Family should have access to family property." That was the line. The exact words. I remember them precisely because of how casually she said them, like she was stating an obvious fact rather than making an outrageous demand. I stood there next to Marcus, waiting for him to say something, anything, to back up his own father-in-law, to acknowledge how strange this entire scene was. He didn't. He stood with his hands in his pockets, looking mostly at the ground, and when Patricia turned to him and said, "Marcus, don't you think that makes sense?" he mumbled something non-committal about not wanting to get in the middle of it. My mother's hand found my elbow and squeezed once, hard, the way she used to when I was younger and about to say something I couldn't take back. I understood the message. Not here. Not yet. I told Patricia, as evenly as I could manage, that I'd think about it. It wasn't a real answer. It was a way to end the conversation without escalating it in my parents' driveway, in front of my father, who I could tell was one more sentence away from saying something considerably less polite than what he'd already said. Patricia seemed satisfied enough with that non-answer to let the subject drop for the moment. She left the key holder on the porch railing, said her goodbyes, and drove off, waving cheerfully like nothing unusual had just happened. The ride home was silent for the first 10 minutes. Then Marcus started talking, and what he said made it clear exactly how far this had already gone in his mind. "I know that was awkward," he said, "but I don't think it's that big a deal in the grand scheme of things. She just wants to feel secure. You could tell her you'll ask your parents to think about it. It doesn't have to be a whole conflict." I asked him whether he understood what he'd just watched. His mother had shown up at my parents' house with a labeled key holder, assigning herself a designated hook, before anyone had agreed to anything. She hadn't asked for a key. She'd arrived acting as though the key was already coming, and all that remained was the formality of cutting it. Marcus's response was to tell me I was being dramatic, that his mother didn't think that far ahead, that she was just excited and maybe got a little ahead of herself, and that the kindest thing I could do was let it go rather than turn it into a battle. That's when I understood something I hadn't fully let myself see until that moment. Marcus wasn't going to be the one to draw this line. If it was going to be drawn at all, I was the one who was going to have to draw it, and I was going to have to do it in a way that didn't leave any room for reinterpretation, negotiation, or a second attempt. I didn't say anything else in the car. I spent the rest of that drive thinking, not about how to argue with Patricia, but about how to make sure this was the last conversation of its kind we ever had to have. I want to pause here, because I know some of you watching this are thinking, why didn't Anna just tell Marcus to handle his own mother? And the honest answer is, I tried. For over a year, I tried giving him room to be the one who set the boundary, because I believed it would mean more coming from him. What I learned is that some people will let a boundary sit unset indefinitely if setting it costs them something with their own family. If you've ever been the one left holding a boundary someone else should have drawn, you know exactly what I mean. Drop a comment if that sounds familiar, and if you're new here, go ahead and subscribe, because this story is about to take a turn. I didn't call Patricia back that week, and I didn't bring up the key holder again with Marcus. Instead, I did something I should have done months earlier. I sat down and thought clearly, without emotion, about what was actually happening. This wasn't really about a key. A key is a small, physical object. What Patricia wanted wasn't a key. It was standing. She wanted a formal, permanent claim to a place in my parents' life and my parents' property that matched the claim she'd already convinced herself she had. The key holder wasn't a request. It was a symbol she'd manufactured to make her desired outcome feel inevitable, the same way Grant, in that story I'd once watched about a woman named Teresa, had made his mother's move-in announcement sound like a decision that had already been made rather than one that required my agreement. I called my parents that Sunday evening and asked them directly how they wanted to handle this going forward. My father's answer was simple. We already told her no. There's nothing more to handle on our end. If she asks again, the answer is still no. My mother, though, was more worried about something else, not the key itself, but the pattern. She pointed out that Patricia hadn't asked once and accepted the answer. She'd escalated 3 times over the course of a year, each time framing her request as smaller and more reasonable than it actually was. A comment about square footage. A comment about the basement. A locksmith quote for a keypad. A labeled key holder delivered like a done deal. Each step had been a little more concrete than the last. If you don't stop this clearly, my mother said, she's going to try again in 6 months with something even further along than a gift bag. She was right, and I knew it. I also knew that the person best positioned to stop it clearly wasn't my father, standing in his own driveway defending his own house. It was me, the person married into this family, the person Patricia had been building her case through from the very beginning. I spent the next several days paying closer attention to things I'd been letting slide. I went back through old text messages between Marcus and me, and between Marcus and his mother that he'd shown me over the past year, looking for the moments where this had actually started. I found them easily, once I was looking. A text from Patricia to Marcus, 10 months earlier, asked Anna's parents if they'd ever consider putting the house in some kind of family trust so it stays in the family long term. Marcus's response, maybe someday, not now. Not a no. A someday. Another message, 6 months earlier, from Patricia, Diane and I were talking, and we think it would be smart if there was a plan for what happens to that Asheville house eventually. You should bring it up with Anna. Marcus's response, I'll think about how to bring it up. He had never brought it up with me. But he also hadn't shut it down with her. He'd been quietly leaving the door open for over a year, agreeing to consider things, promising to think about how to raise them, never once telling his mother clearly that my parents' house was not a family asset up for discussion, planning, or eventual claim. I also thought back to something my mother had mentioned almost in passing, months earlier, that I hadn't given enough weight to at the time. Patricia had asked her, at some family gathering, whether my parents had a will, and whether the house was going to be split evenly between me and my brother or handled some other way. My mother had brushed the question off as nosy small talk. Looking at it now, in the context of everything else, it fit the same pattern. Patricia wasn't just curious about a house. She was mapping out, piece by piece, who controlled it, how permanent that control was, and where the openings might be for her to insert herself into it. I didn't consult a lawyer, because there was no legal question here. My parents' ownership of their own house was not something that needed defending in court. What I needed instead was clarity, delivered once, in a setting where it couldn't be reframed, softened, or negotiated after the fact. I needed Patricia to hear directly, from me, in front of the people whose opinions mattered to her, exactly where this ended. I decided the setting had to be a family gathering, not a private conversation. Private conversations were where Patricia thrived. She was skilled at framing things one-on-one, at making a firm no sound like an unresolved maybe, at following up weeks later as though the earlier answer had never happened. I'd watched her do it to my mother, to my father, and most of all to Marcus, who someday and I'll think about it had given her exactly the kind of soft opening she knew how to work with. What she wasn't prepared for, I suspected, was being told no in front of an audience she couldn't privately relitigate afterward. Thanksgiving was 5 weeks away. Both families would be together, my parents, my brother, Marcus's mother and sister. I decided that was the moment. Not because I wanted a scene, but because I wanted a witness list long enough that there would be no future version of events where Patricia could claim she'd never really been told, or that the answer had somehow changed, or that Marcus had privately promised her something different. In the meantime, I did one more thing. I sat Marcus down, at our kitchen table, on a Tuesday night, and told him plainly what I'd found in those old messages, and what I intended to do at Thanksgiving. I told him I wasn't asking his permission. I was telling him what was going to happen, and I was giving him the chance to either stand next to me when it did, or step back and let me handle it alone. Marcus didn't respond well at first. He accused me of keeping score, of digging through old texts looking for ammunition, of turning a family disagreement into something adversarial. I let him say all of it. Then I asked him one question: in the entire history of his mother raising this subject, in any form, had he ever once told her clearly and permanently that the answer was no? He didn't answer that question. Not that night, and not for several days afterward. But he also didn't warn his mother about what was coming, and when Thanksgiving arrived, Patricia walked into my parents' house with no idea that this was the day the conversation was finally going to end. Thanksgiving was hosted at my parents' house, as it had been every year since before I was born. My mother cooked for 3 days beforehand, the way she always did. My father spent Wednesday afternoon setting up the folding table extension in the dining room to fit everyone. My brother, Kevin, flew in from Richmond with his wife. Marcus's sister Diane came with her new boyfriend, a soft-spoken man named Bill. And Patricia arrived at exactly noon, right on schedule, carrying a green bean casserole and, tucked under her arm, a manila folder. I noticed the folder immediately. So did my mother. Dinner itself was ordinary. Pleasant, even. Patricia complimented the turkey twice. She asked Kevin's wife about her job. She laughed at something my father said about the gutters. If you'd walked into that dining room without knowing anything about the previous year, you would have thought this was simply a warm, unremarkable holiday with a slightly overbearing but harmless mother-in-law at the table. The folder stayed beside her plate through the entire meal, untouched, and I watched her glance at it twice during dessert, the way someone checks their watch when they're waiting for the right moment. She made her move right after the pie was served, when the table had settled into that comfortable, half-full quiet that comes after a big meal. She set her fork down, opened the folder, and pulled out several printed pages. "I know we've talked about this a little before," she said, addressing the table generally but looking mostly at my parents, "but I wanted to bring something more concrete today, since we're all together. I did some research, and I found a really lovely program through a local attorney that helps families set up what's called a family access trust. It lets extended family members have documented, legal rights to visit and use a property, especially in emergencies. I had a consultation last week, and they said it would be a fairly simple process to add me as an authorized party, with a key held at my apartment for exactly that purpose." The table went quiet in the specific way a room goes quiet when everyone has heard something they weren't prepared for and is waiting to see who speaks first. My father set his coffee cup down slowly. My mother's hand, I noticed, had gone still on the tablecloth. Kevin looked at me across the table with an expression that said, clearly, is this actually happening right now? Patricia kept going, undeterred by the silence, sliding the papers toward my father. I had them draft up the basic framework. It's not binding yet, obviously, it would need your signatures, but I thought it would save everyone a lot of back and forth if I just brought something concrete instead of us going in circles again. I looked at Marcus. He was staring at the papers like he'd never seen them before in his life, which, based on his expression, he genuinely hadn't. This was Patricia acting entirely on her own, past every soft someday and I'll think about it she'd extracted from her son over the past year, straight into paperwork drafted by an attorney for a legal arrangement nobody had agreed to. I stood up. Not abruptly, not angrily. I simply pushed my chair back, stood, and picked up the folder from where it sat in front of my father. Patricia, I said, I need to say something, and I need everyone at this table to hear it, so there's no confusion afterward about what was said or what was agreed to. I held the folder up. This house belongs to my parents. Not to me, not to Marcus, not to our marriage, and not to this family in some general, extended sense. It belongs to Robert and Linda Ashford, the two people who paid for it, maintain it, pay the taxes on it, and have lived in it for over 15 years. No one else's name is on the deed. No one else contributes to the mortgage, because there is no mortgage, because my parents paid this house off through 30 years of careful, unglamorous work. That is not a technicality. That is the entire answer to every version of this question you have asked over the past year. Patricia's mouth opened slightly, but I kept going before she could speak. I want to walk through this clearly, because I think it matters that everyone understands the pattern, not just the individual moments. A year ago, you asked my father about a lockbox for emergencies. He told you the house wasn't set up for that. 4 months ago, you showed up here with a locksmith's quote for a keypad entry system, without being asked, and presented it to my mother as something that just needed approval. My father told you no, directly, in this driveway. 2 months ago, you arrived with a labeled key holder, with your name already on it, as though the key itself was simply a formality waiting to be finalized. And today, you brought legal paperwork for what you're calling a family access trust, drafted by an attorney, for a property you have never owned, never paid into, and have no legal claim to whatsoever. I set the folder down on the table in front of her. Every single one of those moments was framed as small. Reasonable. Just in case. But they were never small. They were 4 separate attempts, over the course of a year, to establish a legal or practical claim to a house that belongs entirely to my parents. And I think you know that, because you didn't ask once and stop when the answer was no. You asked, got told no, and came back with something more formal the next time. Patricia's face had gone very still, the warmth draining out of it the way I remembered from the driveway months before, except this time there was nowhere for her to retreat to, no private follow-up conversation to have later where she could soften my answer or reframe it as unresolved. I understand you've had a difficult life, I said, and I meant it. I know what happened with Roger. I know you lost a house you loved, through no real fault of your own, and that you've spent years since then without the kind of security most people take for granted. I am genuinely sorry that happened to you. But what happened to you does not create a claim on what belongs to my family. My parents worked for 30 years to own this house outright. My father spent 3 decades doing electrical work in the summer heat and winter cold so that this place would be paid off and safe and entirely theirs. You watching that happen from the outside, and wanting some version of it for yourself, is understandable as a feeling. It is not, and will never be, a legal or moral claim to their property. I looked around the table. My father's jaw was tight, but he didn't interrupt. My mother had tears in her eyes, but she was nodding, slowly, at every word. Kevin sat with his arms crossed, watching Patricia closely. Diane looked mortified, staring down at her plate. Marcus hadn't moved. So here is the answer, and I want it to be the last time anyone has to give it, I said. There will be no key. There will be no keypad code. There will be no family access trust, no legal arrangement, no lockbox, and no future version of this conversation where the answer is anything other than what it has always been. My parents' house belongs to my parents. If you would like to visit, you are welcome to do so the way any guest is welcome, by calling ahead and being invited. That is the full extent of your access to this property, today and for as long as my parents own it. The room was silent. Patricia sat with her hands in her lap, the folder still open in front of her, papers she had paid a lawyer to draft now sitting untouched and unwanted on a table that had never belonged to her in the first place. For a long moment, nobody said anything. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the dishwasher running in the kitchen and the scrape of Kevin's fork as he set it down carefully on the edge of his plate, the way you set something down when you're trying not to make any sudden movements in a room that already feels fragile. Patricia was the first to break the silence, and when she did, her voice had lost the warmth it carried through the meal. What was left underneath it was something colder, more brittle. "I think you're all being incredibly unfair to me," she said. "I have given this family everything I have. I have shown up to every holiday, every birthday, every event, for years, and this is how I'm treated. Like a stranger. Like someone who doesn't belong here." "You're not being treated like a stranger, Patricia," my father said, speaking for the first time since I'd stood up. His voice was quiet but absolutely steady. "You're being told the truth about what this house is and isn't. Those are two different things." Patricia turned to Marcus, the way she had at the driveway months before, looking for someone to back her up. "Marcus," she said, "are you just going to sit there? This is your wife telling your own mother she isn't welcome in her family's home." Marcus was quiet for a moment. I watched him, and I genuinely did not know, in that moment, what he was going to say. Part of me expected him to soften it, to find some middle ground that didn't exist, to tell his mother she'd misunderstood, that of course she was welcome, that this was all just a miscommunication that could be smoothed over with enough goodwill. Instead, he said something that surprised me. "Mom, nobody said you're not welcome. Anna said you're welcome to visit, the same way anyone visits somebody else's house. With an invitation. That's not the same as saying you're not family." He paused, and then added, quieter, "And honestly, you did go get a lawyer to draft paperwork for a key to a house that isn't ours, without telling either of us first. That's not really a small thing." It wasn't the full, unequivocal support I might have wanted a year earlier, but it was more than he had ever given me on this subject before, and it was enough, in that moment, to matter. Patricia's face shifted again when she heard it, disbelief settling into something closer to hurt, or at least the performance of hurt she'd relied on successfully so many times before. "I can't believe you're taking her side over your own mother," she said to him. "I'm not taking a side, Mom," Marcus said. "I'm agreeing with something that's true. It's not your house. It was never going to be your house. I think somewhere along the way, I let you believe something different, because I didn't want to have this exact conversation. That's on me. But it doesn't change what's actually true." Diane, who had been silent through all of this, finally spoke up, looking mostly at her mother. "Mom, you brought legal paperwork to Thanksgiving dinner. For a house that belongs to Anna's parents. I love you, but that's a lot." Patricia looked around the table one more time, searching, it seemed, for someone who would take her side fully, without qualification. She didn't find one. My mother reached over and gently took the folder from where it sat in front of Patricia, closed it, and set it aside on the sideboard, the way you'd set aside something that had already served its purpose and no longer needed to remain part of the conversation. "Patricia," my mother said, and her voice, for the first time all evening, carried an edge I rarely heard from her. "I want you to know that Robert and I don't say any of this out of unkindness. We've been gracious about this for over a year because we didn't want to make things difficult for Marcus and Anna's marriage. But this is our home. We worked our entire lives for it. And we're not going to keep having a version of this conversation where the answer changes depending on how it's asked." Patricia didn't respond to that. She sat there for a long moment, then quietly began gathering her things, her purse, her coat, the folder my mother had set aside. nobody stopped her. Nobody chased after her with reassurances or apologies. The dinner had reached its natural end, whether anyone had planned for it to end there or not. At the door, she turned back once, looking mostly at Marcus. "I hope you understand what you're choosing here," she said, and then she left, without waiting for a response, her car pulling out of the driveway a few minutes later while the rest of us sat in a dining room that felt, for the first time in over a year, entirely and simply our own. I want to pause here for a second, because I know some of you are thinking about the moments in your own life where you've had to say something difficult in front of people who love the person you're saying it to. It doesn't feel like winning in the moment. It feels heavy, and a little sad, even when you know you're right. If you've ever had to draw a line with someone you still cared about, drop a comment and tell us how it went. And if this story has you thinking about your own family, go ahead and subscribe, because we're not done yet. The days following Thanksgiving were quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar. No calls from Patricia. No messages to Marcus asking him to talk some sense into me. No follow-up folder showing up on a doorstep with a slightly different framing of the same request. For the first time in over a year, the silence didn't feel like the calm before another attempt. It felt like an actual ending. Marcus and I talked more in that first week than we had in months. Not about Patricia specifically, but about the pattern I'd laid out at the table, the someday, the I'll think about it, the year of small openings he'd left without meaning to, or maybe meaning to more than he wanted to admit. He apologized, not in the deflecting way he had before, but plainly. He told me he hadn't wanted to be the one to disappoint his mother, so he'd let the job fall to me by default, and that wasn't fair, and he understood now what it had cost me to be the one who finally said it. I told him I appreciated that, but I also told him the work wasn't only about apologizing for the past. It was about what he did the next time his mother tested the line again, because people like Patricia rarely accept a boundary the first time it's drawn. They wait, they regroup, and they look for a different angle. He didn't have to wait long to prove whether he'd actually changed. 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, Patricia called Marcus directly, without me on the call, and asked him to talk to my parents about at least getting a spare key held for emergencies only, framing it as a much smaller ask than the trust paperwork had been, the same way the locksmith quote had once been framed as smaller than the trust eventually became. Marcus told her, clearly, that the answer was no, that it had always been no, and that he wasn't going to bring it up with my parents again. He told me about the call that same evening, before I'd even asked. Patricia tried once more around the holidays the following year, a soft comment to Diane about how some families are more generous than others, clearly meant to be repeated. Diane didn't repeat it to stir anything up. She repeated it to me directly, laughing about how transparent it was. Nobody at that Thanksgiving table ever needed telling twice. My parents' house stayed exactly what it had always been, theirs. No keypad. No spare key on a labeled hook. No trust, no arrangement, no formal or informal claim from anyone outside the two people who built it. My father still keeps his workshop in the basement. My mother's sewing room is exactly where it's always been. The only key that opens that door belongs to the two of them, and to me and Kevin, the way it always has, as their children, not as some extended definition of family that Patricia had tried, patiently and persistently, to write herself into. Here's what I learned from all of it. A boundary you don't state clearly isn't really a boundary. It's a preference, and preferences get renegotiated. For over a year, my family said no to Patricia in a dozen soft, polite, deniable ways, and every single time, she heard it as a maybe, because that's what soft answers sound like to someone determined enough to keep asking. It wasn't until I said it plainly, in front of witnesses, with no room left for reinterpretation, that the asking finally stopped. I also learned that sympathy for someone's past doesn't obligate you to hand them a claim on your future. Patricia's story was real. She had lost something, and the loss shaped her in ways that were, in their own right, sad. But a hard past doesn't buy a person a key to a house they never built, never paid for, and have no legal or moral claim to. Compassion and boundaries are not opposites. You can hold both at the same time, the way I told her that evening at the table. I'm sorry for what happened to you, and the answer is still no. And I learned that sometimes the person who has to draw the line is not the person everyone expects to draw it. Marcus should have set this boundary with his mother a year before I ever had to. He didn't, because it was easier for him not to. In the end, it fell to me, standing in my parents' dining room on a holiday, holding a folder of paperwork nobody had asked for, saying out loud what should have been said quietly and privately months earlier. It wasn't the way I would have chosen to do it. But it was the way that finally worked. If this story reminded you of a boundary you've been meaning to set, in your own family, with your own in-laws, take that as your sign to do it clearly, the first time, so you don't have to do it again at a holiday table in front of everyone. Thank you for spending this time with us. If you're new here, this is Calm Stories time, and we tell stories just like this one every week. Drop a comment and let us know what you would have done in Anna's place, and if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. We'll see you in the next story.